You are what you eat. We've all heard that expression somewhere along the line. It's become, in recent years, sort of a common trope to talk about the significance of diet and nutrition and healthy lifestyles. But apparently, it seems to go all the way back at least to the early 19th century when in the 1820s a French politician and lawyer, Jean-Antoine Brillat-Savarin, wrote, "Tell me what you eat, and I will tell you what you are." Interesting. It appeared again later in the 19th century, in the 1860s, when German philosopher Ludwig Feuerbach wrote, I quote, "Man is what he eats." Now, neither of those, either Brillat-Savarin or Feuerbach, meant their statements, of course, to be taken literally, nor were they in their time making a point particularly about a healthy diet, like the phrase is usually used in our day. The first, in the 1820s, Brillat-Savarin was emphasizing this very fascinating tight link between human cultures and food and identity, and how all those things relate together. And for those of you who have traveled different places in the world, you know that food is sort of attached. I was surprised in the earlier service where two of the boys said that their favorite food was sushi. That says something about the movement of culture, doesn't it? Pretty cool. Feuerbach was doing something quite different. Feuerbach was a materialistic philosopher of materialism, and when he wrote "Man is what he eats," he was primarily emphasizing his radically materialistic philosophy, basically saying that we are nothing more than animals. And in his case, he pushed it to the next step and said that therefore religion of any kind is meaningless. But they both did realize the strong connection that there is between what we put into our bodies and the effects that it has on our physical and mental health. Many of us have been tuning in whenever we can to the Olympics. You know, it's on my phone and it's on my laptop as I do my work. In the background, I have to go back and forth to the screen, which window is it in, to see what's actually happening there, because it's just captured our imaginations. But maybe you've heard in between the big events, in the reporting, something about Olympic diets. Olympic diets are important, aren't they? And their Olympic diets are sort of tailor-made to the particular event that the person is competing in. And if she's competing in this activity, then there's a certain kind of a diet that'll help them maximize their strength and readiness to compete in that race or that event. And no matter what the level of the diet or the particular combination of different kinds of foods, there's almost always a mixture of certain things. And you know these things, right? It's a mixture of carbohydrates for energy, and there's protein to build lean body mass and to stabilize blood sugar, and there's omega-3 healthy fats like fatty fish and ground flax seeds to help suppress inflammation, promote healing, and increase calories, and plus, of course, lots of fruits and veggies to increase antioxidants and fiber in the system. Now, if you get all excited this morning about an Olympic diet, just be sure to know that you should not have the same quantity that those Olympians were having. They were burning many, many calories a day, which in my sedentary lifestyle, it feels like all I do is sit and go wah, 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 and it doesn't take a lot of energy. So probably the combination of the kinds of things, yes, but not the quantity for a healthy diet. We are what we eat. Orthodox theologian Alexander Schmemann helps me when he very astutely observes that in the biblical narrative of creation, human beings are at the very outset presented as hungry beings. We are hungry creatures. We're hungry beings with the whole world as our food. Schmemann says, second only to the mandate, to the direction, to the instruction to propagate and have dominion is God's instruction to eat. He says, God says there in Genesis 1, see, I have given you every plant yielding seed that is upon the face of the earth, and every tree with its fruit, and you shall have them for food. The human person must eat in order to live. We must take the world into our bodies and transform it into ourselves, into our flesh and blood. We are what we eat. At the very core, human beings, in common with all of the rest of animate creation, are hungry beings. We eat in order to live, right? I mean, you've seen the stats about how long you can go without food and water. We eat in order to live. But here's the question that Schmemann pushes, that draws me in, is we eat in order to live, but what is that life for which we eat in order to live about? In particular, what is human life meant to be? And as Orthodox theologian Schmemann reflects on that very question, he says, he just observes, and he says, most attempts to answer that question have fallen into one of two categories. On the one hand, is the category that says, well, really, human life is primarily a spiritual life, and so we emphasize the spiritual and the religious. And that's real life. That's what we're meant for. And on the other hand, there are those who emphasize the activist approach and the socially active approach and say we really need to make this creation in which we live, the world in which we live, a better place, and that's where we need to spend our time. He goes on to say we either try to spiritualize our life or we try to secularize our faith. And he astutely, I think, observes that whether we invite people into a spiritual banquet or simply join them in the secular banquet, the real life of the world for which we are told that God gave his only begotten Son, remains hopelessly beyond our grasp. What is this all about, anyway? And so when I hear the words of today's gospel, my ears perk up. Or maybe I should say that the gastric juices of my human hunger begin to stir. Did you hear Jesus' words? Repeatedly in this passage, this is week number 4 out of 5 when John 6 is the gospel passage, and we keep hearing this over and over again. And all of it is Jesus' response to having fed the 5,000. And Jesus says these things in today's set of readings. He says, I am the bread of life. Not once in verse 35, but twice again in verse 48, I am the bread of life. And then in verse 41, he says, I am the bread that came down from heaven. And in verse 51, the first half of the verse, he says, I am the living bread. And in the second half of the verse, he says that the life that I will give for the life of the world is my flesh. I'd like us to look at those statements of Jesus. And perhaps we can hear in them an answer to that question. What is the life of life? What is life about? What is the meaning of life? Jesus begins by saying, I am the bread of life. And I'll pair it with that phrase, I am the bread that came down from heaven, Jesus says. We all know, like the children know, that food, that bread, is that which sustains life. Without it, we don't have life. And so in this figurative, metaphorical, theopoetic world that Jesus is drawing us into, inviting us into, it seems that he couldn't be clearer in saying that he is the true manna from heaven. I mean, that's what those people who were there on that day would have thought about. They would have been thinking about what happened to their ancestors when God, for 40 years, kept providing manna from heaven for them to be sustained, because that's what sustained their lives for those 40 years. He's saying, but that manna which was temporary is not the real manna. I am. He's the food that all people need for the life of life, that all people need for what life really is, for what life is intended to be, that he is the source and the pattern and the sustainer for all that human life was intended to be. I am the bread of life. But then he goes on to say in verse 51, I am the living bread. And I honestly agree with most commentators who tend to say, well, this is roughly synonymous to saying Jesus when he says, I am the bread of life. But this one's different. Now the language changes. I'm not the bread of life. I am the living bread. So there's a little subtle difference, a critically important emphasis that is different. What is that difference? Well, those of you who are carnivores in the room, most of the time what you're eating on your plate is not still living. In fact, it sort of creeps you out, right? To think that it might be living. So he's making a point here. I am the living bread. He's making a point that unlike the meal that we consume and it's done and over until the next one, this is something different. Unlike the bread that I go to the bakery and buy, I could stop and talk about bread for a long time. I love bread. I love bread. I love grainy bread. I love sweet bread. I love crusty bread. I love bread. I said I wasn't going to talk about it. I'm not going to talk about it. But see, Jesus is making this point, critically important emphasis, that what he's talking about is not static, but it's dynamic. It's not eat it and it's done, whether you supersize it or not. Someone left the first service saying, it was kind of cool that I could smell McDonald's as you were speaking about food. But this bread is not static, but it's dynamic. It's not transactional, but it's relational. It's not episodic, but it is ongoing. Like that manna of old. Remember the instructions for that manna for all of those years? The instructions were pretty clear. You may gather everything that you will need for one day, except the day before the Sabbath. Then you may gather what you need for 2 days, and it'll stay fresh. Otherwise, it would spoil. This manna, who is Jesus, this bread of life, who is Jesus, is manna that must always be continually partaken. You can be satisfied, but you can't ever have enough as long as life is going on. One of the things that struck those of us who were on the church's trip to Rwanda this time was sadly the hunger. Visiting homes where little children's bellies were pushed out because of malnutrition. There wasn't enough. Near the end of the teaching that we did for those 3 weeks, I wish we would have found out sooner. We didn't know. We're just ignorant with cultural blinders on. We'd have a morning session of the class for 3 hours and a break for lunch and an afternoon session for 3 hours every day for 3 weeks. And in that extended break, we, Pastor Wally and myself, whenever who was teaching which section, would come, having had in the mission guest house a good breakfast. And after the morning session, would go back to the mission guest house for a good lunch. And after the afternoon session, not long later, would come a good dinner. They know how to take care of Americans. Didn't learn until probably the last 4 days that most of our students in the class, if they had anything to eat, it was probably 1 meal a day. And so we felt embarrassed and awkward and foolish for coming back to the afternoon session and saying something like, "Well, how was lunch?" And saw flat emotional responses and stares, too polite to say, "But we didn't have anything." And Jesus says, "I am the living bread." It doesn't run out. It's always, always available. And he emphasizes this in a couple different ways in this phraseology that John uses to tell this story, that those who come to Jesus will receive this bread. But those who come and receive are those who, and there's 2 pairs of words that go together. On the one hand, he talks about them as people who see and believe. And on the other hand, he talks about them as those who hear and learn. Those pairings, I think, are significant because they talk about the attentiveness and receptivity on the one hand, and then responsiveness. I have to see. Sometimes we see things happen, but we don't really see. But when we do really see, do we believe? Do we move to the next step? Seeing and believing is one pair, and the other synonymous pair is to hear and to learn. As I said before, I've been standing up going want, want, want for a long time, and I know that people can hear but not learn in classrooms, sometimes even in congregations. Right? We all are like that. And so there's this receptivity and response. This is living bread. That it's not static, it's dynamic, it's relational, not transactional. It's ongoing in our lives. And then finally, Jesus says, I am the bread that I give for the life of the world is my flesh. And with those final words, it all sort of comes together. With those final words in today's gospel passage, we come to this astounding, grace-filled answer to that foundational question. What is life meant to be? What is the life of life? And his response in that phrase, the interesting phraseology, the bread I give for the life of the world is my flesh. His response echoes all the way back to creation, to the creation of the world, and it echoes all the way forward to the culmination of all things. That is, Jesus is telling us that the bread that he brings, the bread of Jesus, is the completion of creation. He's the one who comes to consummate and make it what it should be and could have been. Jesus comes bringing to possibility and to fruition and to flourishing the very creative intention of God for humanity. Do you hear it? For the life of the world. For God so loved the world that he gave his only begotten Son. The bread that I give for the life of the world is my flesh. And you hear echoes of John's creation account in John chapter 1, and the Word became flesh and dwelt among us. And we see an anticipation in those words, his flesh, of Christ's real presence in the holy table. This is my body broken for you. This is my blood shed for you. What is the life of life? Friends, we were created for communion with God. We were created to be in intimate communion with God, Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, and Jesus makes that possible. We are what we eat. Jesus is the bread of life. He offers himself to us, not once in some initial invitation to follow this path, but every moment of every day of our lives, continually, and we, with the receptivity of faith and with overgrowing gratitude. By the way, that's what Eucharist means, thanksgiving, gratitude. With the receptivity of faith and overflowing gratitude, take and eat and allow the very presence of Jesus to be infused into every part of our being. And thereby, by God's lavishing grace, we take Christ in and allow Christ to transform us so that we might become like Jesus in intimate communion with God. May it be so for you, for me, today, every day, always and forever. Amen.